The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer at 2:41 a.m., a sound that had become Margaret Walsh's lullaby over the past 20 years. She stood in the break room of Mercy General, pushing a mop across tile that reflected the overhead glow like black ice, watching coffee grounds swirl into the bucket with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that invisibility was survival. The antiseptic smell mixed with burnt coffee, the hospital's signature scent, hung heavy in the empty room. Her hands, calloused from 2 decades of nursing and scarred from things that never made it into her personnel file, moved with practiced efficiency. The left one trembled slightly as it gripped the mop handle, not from weakness but from something older, something that lived in her muscles and woke her at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat. She'd been here before. Mercy General was her 8th hospital in 20 years. 8 starts. 8 clean slates. 8 careful erasures of the woman she used to be. The orderly who'd spilled the coffee had apologized 3 times. Margaret had waved him off without looking up. She'd seen worse. Seen blood that looked like coffee, seen men who looked like orderlies until the moment the light changed and suddenly they were something else entirely. The limp in her left leg, a gift from Ramadi, though no one here knew that, ached in the humidity of the pre-dawn hours. She'd learned to move through hospital corridors the way certain animals move through dark forests, present but unnoticed, efficient and quiet, leaving no ripples. The night shift suited her. No department meetings. No holiday parties where chirpy nurses asked personal questions. No one at 2 a.m. wanted to hear about your life. They wanted their charts done, their patients stable, their crises managed by hands that didn't hesitate. Margaret could do that in her sleep. Had done it, literally, in desert compounds where sleep was a luxury that came in 15-minute increments and awareness was the price of breathing. She finished the floor, wrung out the mop with a twist that sent water into the bucket, and walked the familiar path to the locker room. Same locker. 14 years in this hospital, and she'd requested the same locker every year. 3rd row, corner unit, where she could sit with her back against the wall. Muscle memory. Old habits that seemed silly until the moment they saved your life. Her thermos was there, the same dented stainless steel number she'd carried since 2008, filled with black coffee so strong it could strip paint. Her scrubs hung on the hook, navy blue and worn soft from 1,000 washing cycles. Her badge, clipped to a retractable reel, bore a photo from 2009, a woman with harder eyes and tighter lips. That woman had been different. That woman had been someone. Before Margaret became no one. She changed in silence, buttoning her scrubs with fingers that had forgotten nothing about precision. The younger nurses, Casey, Jennifer, the rotating cast of night shift residents, they sometimes tried to include her in their gossip and laughter. Margaret responded with polite deflection. Not tonight, thank you. I'm going to catch up on charting. I hope you have a wonderful party. They meant well. She didn't belong in their world anymore. Casey approached as Margaret reached for her jacket, a worn white lab coat over the scrubs, pockets heavy with stethoscope, penlight, and a pair of trauma shears engraved with a call sign no one here would recognize. Hey, Margaret, are you coming to the Christmas party next week? It's going to be at the Capitol Club downtown. Dr. Sterling's treating the whole department. Margaret paused. She was always pausing these days. Thinking before speaking. Filtering. There was a time when decisions came without the weight of years pressing down on them. I appreciate the invitation. I'll probably work that night. But it's voluntary. The whole staff will be there. It'll be fun, and I work better at night. It wasn't untrue. She did work better at night. The darkness had always suited her. The quiet. The handful of people who asked for help and nothing more, who didn't need her to pretend to be someone with a normal past, someone who didn't know 17 ways to disarm an attacker or recognize the sound of an incoming mortar round. At night, Margaret could be the nurse she'd become instead of the operative she used to be. Casey gave up with a smile and wandered back toward the charting station. Margaret finished dressing, pulling on her jacket and sliding her arms through the sleeves. For a moment, just a moment, and no one was watching, she let her right hand drift to the interior lining of the jacket where a faded unit patch was sewn with careful, invisible stitches. The colors had long since faded, a patch that had once belonged to a SEAL team out of Coronado, a team that had operated in places that still didn't have names in the official records. Her fingers touched it like a prayer. Like a promise. Like an apology to people she couldn't save. She took a breath. Let the moment pass. And folded her hand back to her side. The Mercy General emergency room at 3 a.m. was organized chaos, the kind of controlled storm that Margaret understood instinctively. 2 traumas in beds 3 and 4. A GI bleed waiting for endoscopy. 3 respiratory complaints in the waiting area. The heart monitor in bed 1 beeped a steady rhythm while the monitor in bed 2 chirped a slightly irregular pattern that Margaret logged with a glance. The air smelled like iodine and fear and the particular flavor of exhaustion that came with the graveyard shift. The nursing station was her kingdom, though she'd never claimed it as such. She simply existed there, present but peripheral, the way certain people are present in photographs they're not meant to be in. Janet, the trauma nurse, glanced up from her computer. Margaret, thank God. I've got a 58-year-old male, acute respiratory distress, possible aspiration event. He's been declining for the last 20 minutes. Would you assess? Margaret was already moving. This was the part that made sense. This was the language she spoke fluently. She moved to bed 2 with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to operating under fire, no wasted motion, no hesitation. The patient's chest was labored, his oxygen saturation 89% and dropping. His face held the grey color of a man whose body was beginning the long shutdown. Margaret's eyes catalogued, the wheezing, the intercostal retractions, the way his left side didn't rise as fully as his right. Her hands moved across his chest, palpating, assessing, feeling the story that the monitors could only partially tell. How long since the last suctioning? Her voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard without raising volume. 30 minutes. He was stable until about 20 minutes ago. The resident said. Page respiratory. We need a bedside X-ray, portable chest, and set up for emergency intubation. He's aspirating food material. Margaret's hands were already on the suctioning equipment, already positioning the patient's head. And get me a size 7.5 endotracheal tube. Keep 1.7 and 1.8 open as backup. She worked through the next 3 minutes with Janet at her side, moving with the practiced choreography of 1,000 emergency codes. The monitors climbed, oxygen saturation rising from 89 to 91 to 94%. The patient's breathing began to ease. His eyes, which had held that particular glaze of panic, began to focus. That was when Dr. Marcus Sterling walked into the emergency room for the first time. He arrived the way successful men often arrive, expecting admiration and receiving it instantly from those who didn't yet understand the difference between confidence and competence. His white coat was pristine, pressed with the kind of precision that suggested a service to someone else's standards. His shoes cost more than Margaret's entire week of groceries. He moved through the trauma bay with the air of a man accustomed to being the center of whatever room contained him, and he paused just long enough at the nursing station to survey the scene before nodding toward the residents who had immediately materialized like steel shavings drawn to a magnet. Gentlemen, welcome to your new attending physician. I'm Dr. Marcus Sterling, Duke Medical School, 1997, and I'll be your chief of surgery as of today. I don't tolerate incompetence, I don't accept excuses, and I expect my residents to move like they have somewhere to be. Is that clear? A chorus of yes, doctor, echoed through the bay. Margaret completed her assessment of bed 2, wrote 3 lines of notes on the patient's chart in her compact, precise script, and returned the chart to its slot without looking toward the new arrival. The patient's oxygen sat was stable now. The crisis had already been managed before Dr. Sterling's shoes had crossed the threshold into the trauma bay. She was charting when the shadow fell across her paperwork, the particular shadow of a man accustomed to having attention follow him in 2 rooms. You. The night shift nurse. What's happening with the aspiration in bed 2? Margaret looked up. There was a moment, infinitesimal, controlled, lasting perhaps half a second, where something flickered in her expression. Her eyes met his for long enough to show that she had heard him, that she had understood, that she was choosing her response with care. Patient is stable, Dr. Sterling. Oxygen saturation 94% and steady. Aspiration cleared. Respiratory is on their way for assessment, but is no longer in acute distress. She'd said his name correctly, though he hadn't introduced himself. She'd simply noted the nameplate on his coat. That was what observation looked like when it became a profession. Dr. Sterling's expression shifted. It wasn't quite irritation, it was something more like the small beginning of a question, the kind of question that forms when someone fails to perform the expected ritual of deference and admiration. He'd spoken as though issuing an order to an undifferentiated member of the support staff. She'd answered as though she were a colleague providing a patient update. Well, make sure the resident follows up when respiratory arrives. I want documentation of the contributing factors and a full differential diagnosis. He paused, and when he spoke again, his tone had acquired an edge that hadn't been there before. We maintain certain standards here at Mercy General, and I'll expect to see that reflected in the nursing charting. It wasn't quite an insult. It was something smaller, more precise, a suggestion that her standards might need adjustment to match his. Margaret simply nodded once, a gesture that could have meant agreement or merely acknowledgement, and returned her attention to the chart in front of her. She wrote the next line without pause, her handwriting steady as a surgical laser, each letter precise and measured. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Dr. Sterling turned and walked toward the trauma suite where the residents had begun circling like students drawn to a professor's lecture. Margaret continued charting. The monitor in bed 2 beeped its steady rhythm. The night shift continued its quiet work. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. That moment was coming, and it arrived at 4:33 a.m. when Dr. Sterling gathered the entire nursing staff, night shift, residents, nursing students, everyone with a credential, in the conference room adjacent to the main trauma bay. The fluorescent lights were particularly harsh here, casting everyone's face in shades of exhaustion. Margaret stood at the back, near the door, the way she always positioned herself. Near exits. Old habits. Dr. Sterling stood at the head of the conference table, his posture the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from having every possible advantage. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular tone of a man making a joke that everyone was expected to find amusing. I've spent 1 night here, and I've already identified the problem. The night shift operates like there's no protocol, no accountability, and no actual emergency medicine occurring. He let that land, let the implication settle over the nurses like a weight. But I'm here to establish standards. And I've made a little wager with myself. The night shift nurse, Margaret, is it? Margaret with the mysterious little adjustments to patient care. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had never encountered resistance and had decided in advance that he found it amusing. I'm betting that Margaret quits within 1 week. Once she realizes what actual standards look like, once she understands that this hospital requires physicians to lead and nurses to follow, I suspect she'll find that this position is no longer a good fit for her needs. He looked directly at Margaret then, and the room followed his gaze. 14 sets of eyes, maybe more. Some concerned. Some curious. Some already calculating which way the wind would blow. Margaret's face remained perfectly still. Her hands hung at her sides. Her breathing continued at the same measured pace it had maintained for 20 years of remaining invisible, unremarkable, unthreatening. She didn't flush. She didn't look away. She didn't tremble. She simply met his gaze with the peculiar calm of someone who had already survived worse and would likely survive this as well. Then she returned her attention to the coffee cup she held, took a measured sip, and looked toward the exit as though waiting for the meeting to conclude. The silence in that room lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then someone, one of the residents, began to laugh, uncertain at first, then with growing confidence as others joined in. A bet. An insult veiled in psychology. A new attending physician asserting dominance over a night shift nurse who'd been here 14 years without making waves. What Dr. Sterling didn't know was that Margaret Walsh had spent 2 decades erasing traces of herself so carefully that not even her own son knew where his mother's scars came from. He'd just made a bet that she'd quit in a week, not understanding that she had already left. She'd left a long time ago. The woman standing at the back of that conference room was something else entirely, something that had learned to move through the world like smoke, present but not quite tangible, invisible to the untrained eye. She finished her coffee. And she waited. The betting pool was up to $340 by Wednesday morning. Margaret Walsh doesn't know this yet. She's standing in the break room at Mercy General, watching the old coffee machine sputter its brown liquid into a chipped mug, and she doesn't realize that Dr. Marcus Sterling has already turned her into a wager. That's how men like him operate. They make you the joke before you even know you're being laughed at. 20 years of walking these corridors in silence, and it takes 1 week with a surgeon who got his credentials from Duke and his tan from a country club to make her a punchline. She finishes her coffee. And she waits. By Friday lunch, Margaret understands the architecture of his cruelty. It's not random. It's tactical. He's been assembling his audience all week, the surgical residents who follow him like disciples, the attending physicians grateful for his connections, the younger nurses who mistake his confidence for competence. He's building the stage. And now, in the hospital cafeteria where 40 people eat the same overcooked chicken breast and sad vegetables, he's ready for the finale. Margaret carries her lunch tray through the maze of tables. The fluorescent lights overhead buzz like angry wasps trapped in plastic housings. She's chosen a path that takes her near his table, the only path between the salad bar and the exit, and Sterling sees her coming. His residents are arranged around him like courtiers, laughing at something he's just said, probably about her. She knows the rhythm of it now. The laughter pauses when she's close enough to hear it. Calculated. Theatrical. Sterling stretches his leg into the aisle. Her tray hits the ground before she can process what happened. The crash echoes through the cafeteria like a gunshot in a canyon. Mac and cheese explodes across the tile floor in a yellow spray. Her applesauce carton splits open, spreading pink juice across her shoe. The entire room stops chewing. Conversations freeze mid-sentence. For 3 seconds, the only sound is the soft settling of scattered peas rolling across the linoleum. Sterling's laugh arrives first. His residents follow, their voices climbing over each other in eager obedience. He's already turned back to his table, already performing indifference, already established himself as the victor. Margaret can see his shoulders shaking. One of the younger attending physicians, someone she's worked with for 7 years, is smiling. Not laughing, but smiling in that complicit way that's almost worse. Margaret kneels. She doesn't speak. She doesn't make eye contact. She just kneels and begins picking up every piece, the pasta, the peas, the sliced carrots, the broken applesauce container, the plastic spoon that's now bent beyond usefulness. Her hands are steady. That's the thing she's most proud of in this moment. Her hands don't tremble. They move with the certainty of someone who has done harder things than this. Someone who has picked up pieces of people, not lunch. Someone who has held things together when the only option was to fall apart. The laughter is already fading by the time she stands. Sterling has moved on to his next story, his next audience moment. But Margaret sees the calculation in his eyes when she passes his table. He's noted her composure. He's filed it away. He's thinking, she didn't break. I'll need to try harder. She walks to the trash bin and disposes of the ruined lunch. Then she walks out of the cafeteria without looking back. In the corridor, her pace is measured. Her breathing is controlled. She walks like a woman who has not just been humiliated in front of 40 witnesses. She walks like a woman with nowhere else to be, all the time in the world. It's a lie, but it's a good one. By Friday evening, Dr. Sterling has escalated. Margaret's been expecting this. His social attacks haven't produced the desired effect. She hasn't cried in the bathroom, hasn't called in sick, hasn't quit. So he's moving to phase 2. Undermining. Questioning her competence in front of the attending physicians. referring to her assessments as suggestions instead of observations. Earlier, when she flagged a medication discrepancy, he'd said loud enough for 3 nurses to hear, "Our friend Maggie here is concerned about the paperwork." Probably got confused reading the chart. The attending physician had laughed. The paperwork discrepancy was real. She'd been right. But nobody cared. Rightness isn't the point when you're up against a man with a country club membership and a surgery schedule that makes him essential. The ER waiting room is half full at 6 o'clock. Margaret's in triage, processing intake paperwork for a middle-aged woman with chest pain, nothing alarming on the EKG, probably indigestion, but they'll keep her monitored. The woman holds Margaret's hand while describing her symptoms, and Margaret listens the way she's listened to 10,000 patients, like this moment matters. Like this person matters. Like she isn't a joke. That's when Dr. Sterling appears in the ER doorway, and he's holding a patient chart. His face has that expression, the one where he's decided something, where he's moved from casual cruelty to deliberate performance. He walks toward the nursing station, directly toward Margaret. The ER staff notices the shift in his energy the way animals notice a change in atmospheric pressure. People glance up. The attending physician stops dictating his note. Sterling reaches the nursing station and holds the chart out. Not hands it. Doesn't extend it toward Margaret's waiting hands. Instead, he drops it. The chart falls like a stone, hitting the tile floor with a slap that sounds louder than it should. Papers scatter across the floor. Margaret watches the pages spread out like playing cards dealt by an angry dealer. One lands face down near her shoe. Another slides 3 feet across the linoleum. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling says. His voice is sugar-coating poison. Or is bending over too complicated for someone with your limited qualifications. The ER goes silent the way a forest goes silent before thunder. Margaret takes one measured breath. She looks at the scattered papers. She looks at Sterling's face, and she sees it exactly. The satisfaction. The anticipation. He thinks he's finally found the pressure point. He thinks he's about to watch her break. He thinks he's earned this moment. She lets one tear escape from her right eye. It slides down her cheek like a performance. She doesn't look away. She doesn't break eye contact with Sterling for a single second. She wipes the tear away with the back of her hand, and her movement is so deliberate, so controlled, that it reads as defiance instead of defeat. When she speaks, her voice has the steady quality of a scalpel cutting through flesh. Each word lands with surgical precision. "I've been called worse by better men, doctor. Men who actually knew how to save lives." The silence that follows isn't empty. It's full. It's the silence of a room witnessing something they don't fully understand but sense is important. Sterling's face darkens, not embarrassment, but rage at being denied his victory. He forces a laugh. It sounds like gravel in a blender. He waves his hand dismissively and walks back toward the clinical area, already turning to the attending physician, already moving on as though the moment meant nothing. But it meant something. Everyone knows it. Margaret kneels and picks up the scattered papers. The ER staff slowly returns to work. Conversations resume. The monitor beeps. The vending machine hums. But something has shifted. Sterling's residents are exchanging glances. Even the attending physician is looking at Margaret differently, not with respect yet, but with something approaching curiosity. Who is she? How does someone respond to humiliation like that? Later, when the chaos has settled, Margaret finds the supply closet, the small narrow room where the sterile gloves are kept, where the 4 bags live, where a person can stand for 5 minutes without anyone asking questions. She reaches inside her scrub jacket. Her fingers find the lining near her ribs, where the faded unit patch has been sewn for 14 years. The fabric is worn almost transparent. The unit designation is barely legible now. Ramadi Medical Support, 5th Fleet. She touches it like a talisman. Like a prayer. Like the last thing keeping her tethered to who she actually is instead of who she's pretending to be. Just get through tonight, she whispers to nobody. Just get through the shift. Just get through the week. Just get through the next humiliation, and the one after that, and the one after that, until Sterling gets bored and finds someone else to torment. That's the plan. That's always been the plan. But what Margaret doesn't know, what Dr. Sterling has no idea about, is that sometimes a single moment can erase 14 years of anonymity. Sometimes a man can collapse in an ER waiting room at exactly the wrong time. Sometimes a tear in a scrub jacket can reveal what 3 presidents and 2 wars couldn't hide. Saturday night arrives like an omen nobody asked for. Saturday night at 11:38 p.m., the fluorescent lights of Mercy General's emergency department flickered with the steady hum of a hospital pretending nothing catastrophic was about to walk through its doors. Margaret Walsh stood at the medication dispensary, her hands moving through the ritual of the night shift with the unconscious precision of someone who had performed the same motions 14 years running, when the waiting room erupted into chaos that sounded like breaking glass wrapped in human panic. A man collapsed. 50-something. Military bearing even in collapse, the kind of posture that doesn't abandon you even when your body does. Colonel James Thornton, according to the intake nurse screaming his vitals into the radio. He hit the tile floor hard enough that someone's coffee mug shattered in sympathetic response, and within 4 seconds the automatic doors of Trauma Bay 1 were sliding open like the mouth of something hungry. Margaret didn't run. She didn't need to. She moved toward the sound the way a shark moves toward blood in water, not with urgency, but with the absolute certainty that urgency was already built into her bones. Her scrub jacket caught the fluorescent light, and the tear near the collar, the one from last week when she'd pulled a combative patient away from the windows, exposed just enough of the faded unit patch sewn into the lining beneath to catch anyone's eye, if anyone had been looking at her instead of at the man gasping like a beached fish on the stretcher. Dr. Sterling was already in the bay. He was pale. Not concerned pale, but the pale of someone watching a video game freeze mid-boss fight, hands hovering over the controller, completely disconnected from what needed to happen next. His mouth was open in what might have been words or might have been the sound of a surgeon realizing he had no idea what he was looking at. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, was calling out orders with the kind of clinical precision that comes from having done this 47 times before. O2 sat dropping fast, 68 and falling. Breath sounds absent on the left side. Tracheal deviation. This is a tension pneumothorax. Sterling's head turned toward Chen as if on a mechanism that needed oil. I'll need to consult with cardiothoracic. We should probably get him to the OR, do an exploratory. His voice sounded like a man reading from a script written in a language he didn't speak. Plastic. Hollow. Wrong. Chen's jaw clenched. 47 times, and this was the first time she'd heard a chief of surgery use the word probably in a triage situation. The patient had maybe 3 minutes before his collapsed lung compressed his heart into a position where nothing could save him. There was no time for consultations. There was no time for the OR. There was barely time for the only thing that actually worked. Margaret appeared at Sterling's elbow like she'd materialized from the walls themselves. Needle decompression. Stat. Sterling turned to look at her with the expression of a man watching a nurse suggest she perform a craniotomy with a coffee stirrer. Excuse me. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. 14-gauge angiocath. His O2 sat won't survive the time it takes to theater. Margaret was already moving, already pulling the crash cart open with the smooth efficiency of someone who had run this sequence so many times it lived in her muscles instead of her mind. Prepare for the hiss of air when the needle breaches the pleura. That's when you'll know it's working. Dr. Chen stepped forward. Do it. Now. Sterling's face went the color of old bone. That's outside her scope of. But Margaret had already moved past him like he was furniture. She cleaned the site with antiseptic that smelled like medicine and necessity combined. The angiocath sat in her palm like something that had been waiting for her hand specifically, 14-gauge, gleaming, ready. She placed her fingers on the ribs, counting down from the top, muscle memory and training converging into something that looked like pure instinct but was actually 14 years of silence and 2 decades before that of learning how to save lives in places where hospitals were memories and field dressing stations were carved out of whatever walls didn't have bullets coming through them. The needle went in. The room went dead silent. At first nothing. Then the hiss, that specific, unmistakable sound of air under pressure escaping through a tiny aperture, the sound that meant she'd breached the pleural space, meant the pressure was releasing, meant the lung could expand again. The sound that meant she'd been right and everything else in the room had been wrong. The attending's eyes were on the monitor. O2 sat climbing. 68, 72. 78, 82. Sterling was watching her with an expression that looked like watching someone pull a live grenade from their pocket and defuse it with their thumbnail. His hands were shaking. Margaret didn't notice. She was watching the numbers climb, watching the patient's color return from gray to something approximating human, watching the line on the monitor trace itself back toward something sustainable. Heart rate normalizing, Chen said quietly. "You got him. Good work." Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked out of the trauma bay without saying anything, which was far worse than saying something, which was exactly the point where everything changed. Colonel Thornton's eyes opened then. Not all the way, he was still sedated, still floating in that space between consciousness and the absence of it, but open enough to find her. Open enough to lock onto the tear in her scrub jacket where the unit patch was visible. Open enough for his pupils to dilate with recognition that bypassed every logical pathway in the brain and went straight to something older than logic. "Ramadi," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, fractured, a voice that belonged to someone still halfway between the waking world and whatever dream had pulled him under. "You pulled me out of that school when I was 8 years old. You carried me across the street. I remember your hands." The room was very quiet. Margaret didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply stood there, watching Colonel James Thornton, who had been 8 years old in Ramadi, who had been in that school when the explosion started, who had been someone she'd carried because that's what you did when you found a child under the rubble and you still had enough strength to carry, watching him understand something that she had spent 20 years burying so deep that even her own son didn't know it existed. "Easy," she said, her voice exactly level, exactly calm, exactly what it needed to be. "You're safe now. Rest." The nurse in her was speaking. The person she'd become. The person who worked nights and avoided parties and never mentioned where she'd come from. But the patch under the tear in her jacket had been seen. And the colonel wasn't the only one who'd recognized it. Dr. Sterling was already in his office, already reaching for his phone with the expression of someone who understood, with sudden and perfect clarity, that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation about exactly who he'd been trying to break. His fingers were trembling as he dialed the first number, one of the board members, someone who owed him a favor from a country club golf game in 1998. "I need you to trust me on this," Sterling said, his voice already sliding into its smooth, practiced lie. "There's a liability issue with one of our nurses. Unauthorized invasive procedures." "Yes, I'll send the documentation." He hung up. He made the second call. Atlanta General Hospital, where Margaret's employment records showed a 2-year gap she'd never explained, a void so complete it was almost artistic in its erasure. "I'm calling about a former employee, Margaret Walsh. She worked your night shift from 2006 to 2008. I need a formal reference." "Yes, I'll hold." The waiting was 30 seconds. The answer, when it came, was what he'd hoped for, and no record of anyone by that name. Which meant the records didn't exist, which meant she'd been hiding something, which meant he finally had his leverage, the thing that would make her realize he was the hierarchy and she was nothing. He made the third call to hospital administration. "Emergency credentials review. Tonight. Patient safety investigation. I have concerns about her qualifications." And then he smiled. The CNO found Margaret at the nurse's station at 1:17 a.m. The smile was gone from her face, replaced by something that looked like gentle professionalism but was actually the expression of someone delivering bad news to a person they liked. "Margaret, we need you to come with us. Don't make a scene." Margaret set down the chart she'd been reviewing, Colonel Thornton's post-procedure workup, his vitals stable, his future suddenly uncertain in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. "What is this about? Your credentials are being reviewed. There are questions about your qualifications to perform the procedure you conducted tonight." Margaret stood. She didn't stand quickly. She stood the way a person stands who has been tired for a very long time and understands that standing will not help but is required anyway. "I see." In the HR office, they asked about her previous employment. She answered with fragments and truths, 2 years in Atlanta. Before that, military service. She didn't say where. She didn't say what rank. She didn't say what she'd been trained to do in places where the training was a matter of life and death and the training lasted forever whether you wanted it to or not. "There's no record of you," the HR representative said, not unkindly. "At Atlanta General. No references. No employment file." "There was a records fire," Margaret said, which wasn't true and wasn't false but existed in the space between where the truth lived in her classified files, locked behind doors and NDA signatures that stretched back to before the 9th of November, when the world was different and she had been different and the girl she'd been in Ramadi was someone she'd agreed, under penalty of federal law, never to acknowledge. The security officer arrived at 2:13 a.m. with a cardboard box and the expression of someone who had been told to perform a task and had enough experience with human dignity to make it quick. Margaret's locker was already empty. Her badge was already deactivated. The scrub jacket with the torn collar and the faded unit patch visible underneath was already folded into the box, along with her personal effects, a photograph of her 14-year-old son, a coffee mug someone had given her 5 years ago, her lunch container from the refrigerator that still held the sandwich she'd made that morning. "I'm sorry," the security officer said, and sounded like he meant it. Margaret took the box without saying anything. She walked through the corridors of Mercy General at 2:31 a.m., past the nursing station where she'd spent 5,110 nights being invisible, past the trauma bays where she'd done her work in silence, past the windows that looked out onto Raleigh sleeping in the dark. Dr. Sterling stood in his office window, 14 floors up, watching her cross the parking lot, watching her reach her car, watching her brake lights illuminate the asphalt with the color of endings, and he smiled the smile of a man who didn't understand he'd just made the most significant professional decision of his life. He didn't know who she was. That was going to matter more than anything else he'd ever done. Dr. Sterling's hands moved with surgical precision, but not in an operating room. He sat in his office with the door locked, his mahogany desk between him and the outside world, and he picked up his phone with the deliberate care of a man about to burn bridges he didn't yet understand he needed. The clock on his wall read 11:08 p.m. 48 hours. That's all he had before the board meeting where he would present his case against the rogue nurse who dared to challenge his authority in front of an entire emergency department. He needed ammunition. He needed allies. He needed to make sure that when this was over, Margaret Walsh would never work in medicine again. His first call was to Richard Pemberton, a board member whose country club membership overlapped with Sterling's, whose wife served on the Hospital Foundation board, whose influence spread through Raleigh's medical establishment like roots through soil. Sterling kept his voice level, conversational, the tone of a man sharing a concerning observation among peers. "Richard, I need to flag something for the board's attention before tomorrow's meeting. We had a serious breach of protocol in the ER tonight. A nurse, Margaret Walsh, works nights, performed an unauthorized needle decompression on a patient without physician oversight. Technically an expanded scope of practice that violates our credentialing policy. Could be a liability issue." He paused, letting the word settle. "I'm initiating an investigation into her credentials. Wanted you to know before it becomes official." Pemberton's response was exactly what Sterling needed: concern, willingness to listen, a promise to keep an eye on this. One ally secured. Sterling made 3 more calls in the next 20 minutes, each one slightly different in angle, each one landing the same blow from a different direction. By midnight, the narrative was spreading through the hospital's upper echelon like contamination through a wound. Margaret Walsh had overstepped. Margaret Walsh was a liability. Margaret Walsh needed to be removed before she caused real damage. But that wasn't enough. Sterling needed something deeper, something that would stick, something that would make it impossible for anyone to defend her. He needed her history. At 12:34 a.m., he called Atlanta Medical Center, where Margaret's previous employment ended 14 years ago, with a forwarding address that led nowhere. He spoke to the Human Resources Director, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd been with the system for 23 years and who knew the weight of questions that came from hospital administrators trying to vet their staff. "I'm Chief of Surgery at Mercy General in Raleigh," Sterling said, his voice carrying the effortless authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We're conducting a routine credentialing review on one of our nurses who previously worked with you. Margaret Walsh. Can you send me her employment file?" Chen hesitated, HIPAA regulations, privacy concerns, but Sterling was patient. He suggested a formal written request. He mentioned the credentialing committee. He let the weight of institutional process do the work that intimidation alone could not. What he didn't tell her was that he already knew what he was looking for: the gap. A break in Margaret's history. Something that didn't fit. At 1:15 a.m., Chen called back. Her voice sounded different, confused, slightly troubled. "Dr. Sterling, I'm looking at her file. Margaret worked here for 6 years, left in 1998 without notice, and when we tried to contact her for reference purposes, the forwarding address she provided was incomplete. No phone number on file. No family contact. It's like she deliberately made herself impossible to track." The confusion in Chen's voice was audible. "That's unusual. Most nurses leave a trail. She left nothing." Sterling felt something cold and precise settle into his chest. He'd found what he was looking for, even if he didn't fully understand it. "Thank you, Patricia. That's exactly the kind of detail we need on record." At 2:53 a.m., Dr. Sterling sat across from the hospital administrator, Margaret Winters, in her office on the 3rd floor. The building was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of mechanical insects. Winters was 61 years old, had been an administrator for 19 years, and had seen enough hospital politics to know when something wasn't adding up. Sterling laid out the case with the precision of a prosecutor building a closing argument. "Margaret Walsh performed an unsanctioned medical procedure tonight," he began. "A needle decompression. That's not within standard nursing protocol. But here's what concerns me more: her background doesn't check out. She worked in Atlanta, left abruptly, and deliberately left no way to contact her. No forwarding address. No references we can verify. When I pulled her credentialing file, there's a significant gap in her employment history from 1998 to 2005. 7 years. The woman simply doesn't exist on paper for 7 years." Winters leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "You're suggesting she falsified her credentials?" "I'm suggesting we don't know who she is," Sterling said, and it was the closest thing to the truth he'd said all night. "For all we know, she could be operating under an assumed name. Could be a felony on her record. Could be anything. But we have a patient, a colonel, military background, who recognized her from something in her past. The whole thing is suspicious. And in our position, can we afford to ignore it?" Winters made a phone call at 2:45 a.m. to hospital security and the Human Resources Director. By 3:10 a.m., the decision had been made. Security would escort Margaret from the building. Her credentials would be suspended pending a full background investigation. She was terminated, effective immediately, pending review. It wasn't formal or loud or dramatic. It was administrative. It was the kind of thing that happened quietly to people who asked too many questions or challenged the wrong person. Sterling watched from the hallway as 2 security officers found Margaret in the break room, still wearing her scrubs, still moving through her shift with the methodical precision of someone who'd performed the same tasks 1,000 times before. He saw her face when they told her. He waited for her to cry, to protest, to beg. He waited for the satisfaction of seeing her break. She didn't break. She simply nodded, removed her badge from around her neck, and placed it on the counter. Then she walked toward the exit with the 2 security officers flanking her like guards escorting a prisoner who'd already accepted her fate. Sterling followed at a distance, and when she reached her car in the parking lot, she didn't slam the door or scream into the night. She sat in the driver's seat, stared at nothing, and then she drove away. Margaret's hand shook on the steering wheel only after she'd left the hospital parking lot. She could feel the adrenaline draining from her system like water from a broken vessel, leaving behind something hollow and ancient and impossibly tired. The scrubs clung to her skin, damp with sweat from the shift that had just ended her life. The cardboard box containing her personal belongings, a small plant from her locker, a photograph of her son, a coffee mug someone had given her years ago, sat on the passenger seat like a bomb that hadn't detonated yet. Raleigh at 3:15 a.m. was a city of empty roads and closed storefronts, and Margaret drove through it like a ghost haunting a place she no longer belonged. She knew every traffic light, every landmark, every turn that led home, and her body moved through them on muscle memory alone while her mind fractured into pieces that didn't fit together anymore. The house was dark when she pulled into the driveway. The small colonial-style structure she'd bought 14 years ago, the place where she'd tried to build a life that made sense, suddenly looked like a stranger's home. She sat in the car for 7 minutes before she found the strength to open the door. The kitchen table was where she finally stopped moving. She sat in the wooden chair, the same chair where she and her son ate breakfast, where he did his homework, where they'd celebrated his 13th birthday last August, and she couldn't go any further. The scrub smelled like disinfectant and her own skin, and her hands kept trembling even though she pressed them flat against the table's surface, trying to anchor herself to something solid. Ramadi crashed over her like a wave. It was the 8-year-old boy first, always the boy. His name had been Lathe, though she'd never known that when she pulled him from under the teacher's desk in the school building while rounds of small arms fire tore through the concrete walls around them. She could hear the sound of his breathing, the way his small hands had gripped her uniform, the moment his eyes went wide when the first ceiling tile fell and he thought the whole building was coming down. She could smell the dust, the cordite, the copper of blood that wasn't entirely his own because she'd been shot in the shoulder and hadn't noticed until later. Margaret put her head down on the table and felt something inside her crack open like porcelain hitting tile. Her hands covered her face and the crying came in waves that surprised her because she'd thought she was finished with this kind of breaking, had thought that 2 decades of silence and routine and small mercies had somehow fixed what couldn't be fixed. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in gasps. She couldn't stop it any more than she could have stopped her heart from beating, and when she finally heard the soft footstep on the kitchen tile at 5:32 a.m., she didn't even lift her head. "Mom." The voice was small and frightened and impossibly young. "Mom, why are you home? You work nights. Why are you?" Margaret couldn't answer. She couldn't move. She could only shake her head, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand, unable to make her face into something that resembled a mother instead of a soldier who'd just come home from a war that had never actually ended. Her son, Daniel, was 14 years old. He was tall now, gangly in the way of boys on the edge of becoming men, and he stood in the kitchen doorway wearing his Spider-Man pajamas and looking like his entire world was collapsing in slow motion. He sat down across from her without asking permission, his eyes searching her face for clues she couldn't give him. "Did someone die?" he asked, because that was the only emergency he understood, the only crisis big enough to bring his mother home in the middle of her shift. Margaret's voice came out smaller than she'd expected. "No, baby. I saved someone. And I lost everything." She watched him process this, the confusion, the struggle to understand a mathematics that didn't add up, the way his jaw tightened the same way hers did when he was fighting not to cry. He stood up without another word and went back upstairs. She heard him moving around in his room, heard the soft click of his laptop opening, heard the sound of him searching for answers that she'd hidden from him her entire life. 2 hours passed. The sun came up over Raleigh like nothing had changed. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and didn't move. She was still wearing her scrubs. The hospital badge was still in her pocket. The life she'd constructed so carefully, brick by brick, year by year, had just been dismantled in the span of a single shift, and there was nothing left but the original foundation, the part of her that had never really left Ramadi at all. Daniel came downstairs at 7:27 a.m. carrying something that made Margaret's blood stop in her veins. It was a showbox, cardboard worn at the edges, and he placed it on the table with the solemnity of someone handling evidence at a crime scene. Inside, she could see the corners of medals, the edge of a ribbon, the corner of a photograph of herself in navy dress whites, her face younger and harder and belonging to someone who didn't exist anymore. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice cracking, "why didn't you tell me?" Margaret stared at the box like it was a portal to a life she'd spent 2 decades trying to seal away. She couldn't speak. The question required an answer that would break something else, and she'd already lost enough for one morning. 48 hours. That's how long it took for the truth to walk through those hospital doors. The Mercy General Administrator's office was cold in a way that had nothing to do with air conditioning. Sarah Chen sat at her mahogany desk, hands trembling as she shuffled through papers, when the knock came, soft, deliberate, the kind of knock that belonged to someone who understood protocol. The door opened and a 14-year-old boy stood in the threshold, his mother's eyes, his father's jawline, and in his hands a showbox that looked like it had survived wars. Which it had. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh," the boy said, his voice cracking on the rank like he'd practiced it 100 times in the mirror. "They need to see these." Sarah's breath caught. She didn't move. The boy stepped forward and opened the showbox with the reverence of someone handling sacred things. Medals spilled across her desk like coins from a treasure chest. Burgundy ribbons with silver stars. Bronze bars indicating valor. Certificates with military seals and dates that stretched back decades. 23 years. 3 continents. Numbers that told stories nobody was supposed to know. The boy set down a commendation file thick as a medical chart. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. Her voice broke as she read the words aloud, each phrase landing like a physical blow. Extracted 42 civilians under enemy fire. Single-handedly held a medical station for 16 hours. Sustained 2 direct combat injuries and refused evacuation until all personnel were stabilized. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat closed. The office door opened again. A man in dress blues walked in, tall, shoulders like an atlas holding up the sky, the insignia of a Navy SEAL commander on his collar. Behind him, a 2-star Air Force general, jaw set, flanked by 2 Pentagon staffers who looked like they could shut down buildings with a phone call. The SEAL commander stood and his voice filled the room like a command frequency, Bronze Star with valor. He paused, letting it hang. The boy's chin trembled. Purple Heart. Another pause. Every second felt like a fuse burning. Navy Cross. The last word landed and the room couldn't breathe. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway. Someone had called him. His face drained of color the way a bathtub drains when you pull the plug. His mouth opened and closed like a fish recognizing the hook. The general stepped forward. His voice was steady, measured, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived every consequence. Senior Chief Walsh was the operative who extracted Colonel Thornton from a school building in the Jolan district, Ramadi, Iraq, on March 15, 2008. She carried him for kilometers under active fire. She kept him alive when his lungs were filling with blood. The Air Force is immediately investigating how a decorated war hero was terminated for saving one of our own. He let that sit. Sterling's hand started to shake. "You're finished, Doctor. Effective immediately. Your personal effects will be collected by security and delivered to your home. You are no longer employed at this institution." The silence was so complete you could hear the rain starting outside. It came down like applause, like the sky itself was bearing witness. Sterling turned to leave and nobody moved to stop him. There was nothing left to say. The machinery of the federal government had spoken. 6 months later, Margaret Walsh pulled her 2019 Honda Accord into the parking lot of a strip mall in South Raleigh. The sun was low and orange, throwing long shadows across the cracked pavement. She'd just finished her first shift as Director of Emergency Medicine at Mercy General, a position the hospital had created specifically for her. Her name was on the office door now. Her rank was embroidered on her white coat. She'd spent the afternoon training a third-year resident in trauma assessment, her voice steady and authoritative, every word carrying the weight of decisions made under fire. She took the exit toward home, and that's when she saw the folding table under a faded striped umbrella. Dr. Sterling sat behind it in a wrinkled polo shirt, the kind that came from a clearance rack at a discount store. Insurance company brochures fanned across the folding surface like desperate hands reaching for rescue. His shoes were scuffed. His hair had gone grey. His hand shook as he held out a flyer to a woman pushing a shopping cart, who walked past without making eye contact. He looked up when he heard the car slow. Their eyes met across 20 feet of asphalt and time collapsed. Sterling's mouth opened like he wanted to say something. An apology. An excuse. A plea. His hand came up, trembling so badly he nearly dropped his stack of brochures. For a moment, just a moment, he looked exactly like what he'd become. Not a doctor. Not a man with a country club membership and a network of allies. Just someone who'd picked the wrong fight with someone he couldn't begin to understand. Margaret took one measured breath. The same breath she'd taken when he threw the chart at her feet. The same breath she'd taken before the needle decompression. She didn't nod. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply pressed the accelerator and drove past without slowing down, her eyes forward, her composure unbreakable. The rain hammered her windshield as she drove toward home. When she pulled into her driveway, her son was waiting at the window, homework abandoned on the kitchen table. Colonel Thornton sat in the living room, flowers in his lap, color photographs spread in front of him, pictures of the school in Ramadi, the garden where Margaret had sung to him while carrying him through the streets, her voice steady and clear and defiant even as rounds kicked up concrete around them. They laughed that night. Real laughter. The kind that heals. Margaret's son asked her, "Do you regret leaving the military, Mom?" She thought about the question. About the weight of the show box. About the medal she'd hidden so carefully that even her own child didn't know his mother had been a hero. About the 14 years of night shifts and quiet competence and invisible sacrifice. About Dr. Sterling in his wrinkled shirt, hands shaking, unable to meet her eyes. "I regret hiding who I was," Margaret said, her voice like armor that had finally stopped needing to protect her from the world. "But I don't regret choosing to heal instead of fight." The next morning, Margaret arrived at Mercy General as the sun came up. The ER staff stood and applauded when she walked through the doors. Not because they were required to, but because they understood now. The quiet nurse who'd worked the night shift for 14 years hadn't been running from something. She'd been running toward it. Toward the place where she could save lives without explaining why her hands were so steady. Why she never flinched. Why she'd known exactly where the needle needed to go. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story moved you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. What would you do if the world finally discovered who you really were? Drop a comment below. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, share your story. Let's celebrate the quiet heroes among us.